You're listening to the Libertarian Express Radio Network.
Hello and welcome to the show. Today is Wednesday, February 12th, 2014. This is our first show of the new year, and with any luck, we should be able to get back on a regular schedule, providing you with at least one show per week very soon. I know that many of you have sent in questions regarding past episodes, and I promise that eventually I will answer some of those questions. I may even dedicate an entire show to answering them. Don't know yet. But for now, I want to discuss a topic brought to light by Lars Larson. And so, today's topic, without further ado, is: should ex-felons have their rights stripped for life, or should they be restored after they have regained their freedom? We will discuss what the founders thought about this topic, what modern Americans believe about this topic, and what the reality of the situation is. Recently, Attorney General Eric Holder has come under fire for his stance that ex-felons should be allowed to vote. In several states, they are not allowed to do so. In fact, each state has laws on the books which strip ex-felons of many of their constitutional rights, sometimes indefinitely. There are even some federal laws which strip ex-felons of certain unalienable rights for life, such as the right to bear arms, for example. Attorney General Holder is raising the voting issue with those states which disallow voting by ex-felons. And this is a very rare instance in which I actually agree with him, but not for the reasons you might think. I don't believe, as he does, that most ex-felons will vote Democratic. In fact, recent studies have shown that ex-felons tend to support third parties more than the two major parties. But before we get into the issue of which rights, if any, should be returned to ex-felons, I want to dispel a popular myth about prisons and prisoners. Since most Americans allow others to do their thinking for them, most Americans have bought into the lie that ex-cons are murderous, child-raping cannibals who frequently engage in sexually lewd acts with animals. This is, of course, not the case. While that statement is certainly true about some criminals, most are typical blue-collar working-class people. Once they have served their time, it is their hope to return to being blue-collar working-class people. Unfortunately, our society no longer allows this. Where we once were a country that believed in giving ex-felons a second chance after their release, we are now a country so paranoid and so gripped by fear that we currently subscribe to the philosophy of punish, 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 and when you're done punishing, punish again. Repeat indefinitely. However, this philosophy is inconsistent with the core values we Americans espouse. Felons have a difficult time finding work upon their release because of the social stigma associated with them. Contrary to popular belief, most want to return to work. They want to stay out of prison. Prison is not a place in which most people aspire to live. The myth that prison is a country club environment is completely untrue. Prisons are a dangerous, cold, and terrible environment. It is true that prisons have televisions for inmates to watch, and why wouldn't they? Most Americans use television to babysit their children. Doesn't it make sense to use that same idiot box to babysit inmates? I mean, it's a pacifier, and it works. Prison guards would find their jobs to be 100% more challenging than currently, where there are not televisions in prisons. It's also true that prison inmates are fed 3 times per day. However, it is untrue that prison inmates are fed food as good as or better than what you and I eat daily. In fact, prisons save money by making deals with food processing companies to purchase food that is not fit for human consumption. In other words, food that is not legal for grocers to sell to human beings for their personal consumption. Take corn, for example. About 90% of the corn produced in America is a low-grade corn, which the FDA has determined is not good for humans to consume, but is acceptable to use as animal feed. This corn is considerably less expensive than the higher-grade corn we humans eat. Prisons purchased lower-grade corn in order to save money. Vegetables and meat that would normally be sold to dog food manufacturers because it's not legal to sell to humans is what most prisons purchase for their inmates. There are no prisons that feed their inmates caviar or pheasant. Not even white-collar prisons. It just doesn't happen. It is a myth perpetrated by talking heads in order to increase the ratings of their show. But trust me, Bernie Madoff is eating feed corn and dog chow just like every other inmate. He will not be rewarded for his crimes until after he has been released from prison, when he will be given a job with the federal government. However, often prisons will allow inmates to have a garden for the purpose of growing fresh vegetables. The problem is most of those vegetables end up in the homes of the guards, the staff, and the administration of those prisons. What doesn't go to their homes is used to feed the guards in their lunchroom cafeteria. The inmates get whatever is left over, which is usually enough to feed them for 1, maybe 2 meals. The prison warden will have television camera crews and reporters out to his prison to show them what wonderfully enlightened work he is having the inmates perform, and he brags about how much money this gardening will save the state. And the press will eat it up, and they'll sing his praises for a week or so, stroking his ego like you wouldn't believe. And the people will believe the lie, and they will feel good about themselves because they're part of a society which teaches even the scum of our citizenry skills like gardening. Yes, there is recreation available to inmates. After all, this isn't the Middle Ages where people are thrown into cages and left to die of starvation and disease. We have matured as a species since then, and in our enlightened state, we have determined that exercise is healthy and good for people. It reduces the medical costs which prisons would otherwise have to incur by not allowing recreation. Prisons are increasingly becoming non-smoking environments. This reduces the cost of insurance, which is required by law for prisons to carry on each inmate. It also reduces the cost of health care, which is not only required, but is humane. I know many of you out there don't believe that inmates should be afforded health care, and if you're one of those people, you need to check yourself because you are not the good person you claim to be. Prisoners are given a bed, a mattress, a pillow, and a blanket. Now these beds are often concrete slabs or a steel construct. The mattress is usually a 2 or 3 inch thick vinyl sheath with cotton or synthetic fiber ticking stuffed into it. The pillows are not the high-tech comfort guaranteed pillows you and I sleep on every night. They are the same vinyl sheath, cotton, and synthetic fiber stuffed monstrosity as their mattress. Their blanket is a wool blanket, usually like the kind used by the military. While they may serve to keep the inmate warm on cold nights, they are itchy and they are uncomfortable. And if the inmate happens to have a wool allergy, too bad for him. When you and I go to sleep at night, we turn off our lights and we sleep peacefully until morning. Inmates are not given this luxury. The lights in their cell are on all day, every day. They never turn off. If an inmate chooses to use something to cover his eyes to simulate darkness, he is punished. He must sleep in the light. Sleeping until morning is impossible, as guards are required to perform bed checks 2 or 3 times per night, which requires the inmate to stand by his bunk until the check is over. And this can sometimes last as long as 2 hours if the barely educated guard entrusted with the extremely complicated task of counting inmates should count incorrectly. All inmates are required to be out of their bunks at 6 a.m., and so they get maybe 2 or 3 hours of sleep between bed checks, and they must arise for the day earlier than many of us do. That is, those inmates who aren't kept up all night being raped by their cellmates. There are often 4 men to a cell, which is only 8 foot long and 6 foot wide. They share one toilet, one sink. Often they share one inmate too. Many prisons only allow their inmates 1 hour of outdoor recreation. Sometimes this is daily, and sometimes this is every other day. Prisons where the inmates are required to work often cannot meet that requirement because of the political maneuvering of unions. So the inmates are relegated to cleaning toilets, mopping floors, or doing laundry. And yes, sometimes they make big rocks into little rocks. I even toured one prison that made their inmates rake rocks into a pile. When the area the prisoner was responsible for was completely rock-free, the inmate was then required to spread those same rocks he had just raked over that area again. He then had to rake them into a pile again, and then he had to respread them again. And he had to do this every day for 8 hours a day. What little pay inmates are given for their labors is taken from them to pay for toiletries, rent, any fines incurred due to misbehavior, and other such things. In the end, the inmate is left with barely enough to purchase a luxury like paper in an envelope so that he can write a letter home. This is the reality of prisons. This is what it's really like. And I haven't even begun to deal with things like mistreatment at the hands of the guards, or other inmates even. Female inmates being raped by their male captors, male inmates being raped by their male captors, or even other inmates. The gangs that actually run the prisons. The guards who form their own cliques into the good guards and the guards that are on the take. Inmates are often killed for perceived slights or wrongdoings, and sometimes it's even the inmates who do the killing. So anyone who tells you that people actually want to go to prison is either speaking from ignorance, or they're repeating what the talking heads on their television sets have told them to repeat. Whether or not inmates deserve this treatment is not the purpose of this podcast, and I won't debate that here. We'll do that another time. I tell you about it simply because I want you to know the truth. Prisons are not fun. Prisons are not glamorous. Prisons are not a place anyone wants to be, in spite of the popular myth to the contrary. Now back to the issue at hand. Let's examine the issue of whether or not ex-felons should be allowed to vote. But first, let's have a little history lesson. After the Civil War, white Democrats were concerned that poor blacks would exercise their newly won right to vote. And they, of course, did not want this to happen. But the Supreme Court ruled that they could not enact laws preventing them from voting. So they did what politicians always do. They found a backdoor solution. Since most of the prison population of the southern states at that time consisted of poor black men, they passed laws which disallowed felons from ever voting again. Now, this hurt a few white voters, to be sure, but since most of the men in prison at that time were black, the white men were considered to be acceptable casualties. Currently, there is no federal law which restricts felons from voting under any circumstances. That issue is one left up to the several states. And today, in most states, they have some means of reconciliation for ex-felons. That means they have a means by which ex-felons can regain their right to vote. In some states with smaller populations, felons are allowed to vote even while in prison. Some states allow ex-felons to vote only after they're released from prison, and some require the ex-felon to wait until they've completed their parole or probationary period. But there are still some holdout states which don't allow ex-felons to vote ever again. Now, it should be noted that in the case of every one of those states in which ex-felons are never again allowed to vote, they have a significant enough population that they don't have to worry about the loss of votes. Now, let's consider for a moment why, in today's America, politicians would not want ex-felons to vote. It is not because it's a means of punishment. They aren't saying to the felon, you committed a felony, therefore you lose your right to vote forever because you committed a felony. No, that isn't the reason at all. The reason is to control the votes. You see, recent studies have shown that in states where ex-felons are allowed to vote, most of them tend to support parties other than Democratic or Republican parties. Now, politicians are afraid of these kinds of people. They're afraid of people who think outside the box. They are afraid of people who have demonstrated that they cannot be controlled and made to think the way they are told to think. They want people to fall into lockstep with the party line and never question. And felons are not the kind of people who do that. They always question authority. And this is one reason why felons migrate to third parties. Another reason they don't want felons voting is because of the predicted future demographics of felons. Currently in America, about 5% of our population is incarcerated. About 15% of our population has some sort of felony record. It is predicted that by the year 2100, more than 25% of living Americans over the age of 18 will have a felony record. Now that's significant. That's very significant. 1 in 4 Americans will have felonies in less than 90 years. Disallowing them the right to vote means that it's easier for the government and those in power to control the thinking of the rest of the public. Now, given this knowledge, one must then ask, why is Eric Holder pushing states to allow ex-felons to vote? And the answer is simple: gratitude. He and the Democratic Party is hoping that the felons will be so grateful to the party for restoring their right to vote that they will become Democrats. And some will. But I believe most won't. Some will not bother with voting, as they're either too angry to involve themselves with the process, or they've become so disillusioned with America that they no longer care enough to vote. Of those who do exercise their right, most of them will likely migrate to one of the so-called third parties, if only despite the two main parties. But should ex-felons have their right to vote restored to them? And the short answer is a resounding yes. The founders never intended for the rights as defined in the Constitution to be taken away permanently. If they had, they would have never set up the penal system to afford each man a horse, a rifle, and $20 in gold upon their release from prison. And yet that's exactly what they did. And this brings up the question of whether or not ex-felons should have the right to bear arms restored to them, since it is glaringly obvious that it was never intended for that right to be permanently denied to a felon. Why have we done so today? Well, let's look at the previous statistic again. By 2100, if 25% of the population is unarmed because they have a felony, it's that much easier to control them. When you factor in the irrational fear of Democrats towards firearms and their unwillingness to own them, you now have about 62% of the population completely unarmed and easily controlled. With the population expected to exceed 400 million by the year 2100, that means approximately 100 million people will possess firearms of some sort, or about the same number as today. In effect, by disallowing ex-felons their right to purchase and own or carry arms, you prevent the number of gun owners from increasing. Now, statistically, crimes which don't involve the use of firearms far outnumber those in which firearms are used. Edged weapons, blunt weapons, and vehicles, they each account for more crimes than handguns, rifles, and other firearms combined. So why are gun rights not restored to felons upon regaining their freedom? Fair question. Politicians have learned that the best way to accomplish a goal is to create an atmosphere of fear in the populace, and then enact a law which appears to deal with that imaginary fear. In America, currently, it's popular for politicians to use our fear for the safety of our most vulnerable, our children and our elderly, and our fear of felons to enact laws. Don't believe me? Ask yourself this. How many times have you heard a politician or their mouthpieces, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, those people, say things like, if we don't pass this law, we are going to be forced to release sex offenders from prison, and they're going to come and eat and rape your children in that order. Or some other similar tactic. Frequently, they use these tactics because they know they work. They know that we will fall for it every damn time. Now, it's no secret that there is a plan to eliminate gun ownership by civilians in America. The way to start this is to create fear around those perceived to be the most likely to abuse the right. And who would that be? Felons. By disarming felons, politicians are given kudos by the population for doing something. The fact that the politicians are really doing nothing is never brought up. But the people feel good because something was done, and they can return to their regularly scheduled television shows. Meanwhile, 15% of our population is now unarmed and unable to defend themselves. Now, I know that you don't care, because after all, they are only felons, right? We only consider them human beings because they just happen to inconveniently fall into the classification of Homo sapiens. And if it weren't for that inconvenient fact, we would be more than happy to label them as animals. And don't sit there and tell me I'm wrong, because you know I'm not. Now consider this. Most people are good people. Most people want to do the right thing. Most people do the right thing. Now, if this is the case, how come the number of felons in America is expected to rise from 15% to a whopping 25% in less than 90 years? It isn't because our economy will tank. It probably will, but that's not the reason why. It isn't because there won't be jobs. It isn't because criminals will breed like rabbits and make more criminals. It's because everything will be made illegal. If you do anything that does not increase the power or wealth of the government or their corporate masters, you will be charged with a felony, found guilty, and given a trial for show. So here's my opinion for the one or two of you who may actually care. This country, whether we like it or not, was founded on certain Christian principles. While I'm not a Christian, I do recognize this fact. It is believed by a majority of Americans that our Constitution is a divinely inspired document. The Declaration of Independence states that we believe that certain rights are unalienable and granted to all human beings by nature and nature's God. The Constitution defines what these rights are. So as a society, we have to ask ourselves this question: do we really believe in what these documents declare? Are these rights truly unalienable and granted to us by God? If they are granted to us by God, that means no man and no group of men can deny us the opportunity to exercise those rights regardless of any mistakes we may make in our lives. If these rights are truly God-given, then only God can take these rights from us. So unless Congress believes themselves to be prophets of God, could you imagine that? They have no authority to take those rights from any person for any reason. If we as a society determine that those words no longer represent our beliefs, and that those rights are not derived from nature and nature's God, then we have to ask ourselves some other difficult questions, such as, where do we stop? If a person commits a felony, do we take away his right to free speech? Do we take away his right to practice the religion of his choice? And if so, what religion do we force him to practice? Or do we force him to practice no religion? Do we take away their Fourth Amendment protections and leave them open to the abuses of the police? Do we take away their Fifth Amendment rights? Where do we stop? Can we house troops in their homes without their consent? If we strip them of all rights for the remainder of their lives, what are we to do with them? They will no longer have the right to work, own a home, go to the grocery store, or live anything even remotely resembling a normal life. So what do we say? Do we just say anyone who is ever convicted of any felony will spend the remainder of their life in prison? And if we do that, who's going to pay for it? I mean, we're talking about more than 100 million people incarcerated. That's the equivalent of every man, woman, and child living east of the Mississippi River in the United States. For those states wishing to continue the practice of not allowing felons to vote, I believe the number of felons in that state should be subtracted from the state's total population when determining the number of electoral votes for that state. I mean, since they don't have an opportunity to help decide on their representation, they should not be counted in the state's population when determining how many electoral votes that state has. States like California and Florida would lose several electoral votes, decreasing their influence in the general elections. Additionally, since these people are not represented, they should not have tax obligation to the state, because taxation without representation is not allowed in this country. People, the first step in taking away your freedom is to take it away from those whom we don't care about. In America, we don't care what happens to felons. We believe they get what they deserve and should continue getting what they deserve for the remainder of their lives. Now, whether that's right, wrong, or indifferent, I don't know. But what I do know is the government is happy to take away their rights because they know it is the first stepping stone to taking away your rights. They know you will allow it because you're too blinded by your manufactured and irrational hatred toward them to stop it from happening. You may know of that poem about they came for one group of people and I did nothing because I didn't belong to that group, and they came for another group of people and I did nothing and because I didn't belong to that group, and finally they came for me and there was no one left to stand up for me. Well, I've kind of modified it a little bit. I've modified it to meet the needs of the 21st century, meet the standards of the 21st century. First, they came for the criminals, and I did nothing because I'm not a criminal. Then they came for the homeless, and I did nothing because I am not homeless. Then they came for the poor, and I did nothing because I am not poor. Then they came for everyone else, and I could not stop them because I gave them all my power. We are at a point where we are going to define our country and our society for the next several centuries with this issue. We are going to show the world that we are either a country that doesn't really believe in our divine inheritance, or we are a country willing to forgive even the worst among us and restore them to their rightful place as citizens of America and children of God. I'm Robert Rowe. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions or comments about today's show, please email me at libertarianexpress@gmail.com. That's libertarianexpress@gmail.com. And as always, I hope you have a great day.